Welcome to Teolumen Insights, where we reveal the hidden forces that shape the way you live and show you how to use them to create real transformation and supercharge your health, mindset, and daily life. Here are your hosts, Emma Greenwood and Nathan Sinclaire.
Welcome to Teolumen Insights, everybody. I'm Nathan Sinclaire.
And I'm Emma Greenwood.
And today we're diving deep into a question that's been plaguing really pretty much everyone, I guess, for all of history. Why is proving the existence of God so hard?
It's a big one.
It really is. And we're going to be calling on the thoughts of Leo Gura for this deep dive. He's done some pretty expensive reflections on this topic, and we're gonna try to unpack it all just for you.
Right. We're not here to tell you whether God exists or not. We're really looking at the inherent difficulty of proving or disproving that idea.
Exactly. And we're going to be looking at a whole bunch of different arguments today, philosophical arguments, theological arguments. I mean, there are so many arguments out there that try to tackle this question. And our mission, I guess you could say, is to understand, why is this so difficult? Why is it so hard to even approach this concept?
Regardless of whether you believe in God or not, it's really fascinating to see how many different ways people have tried to tackle this question. We're going to be looking at the nature of metaphysics, the study of reality itself, and all the traps that are inherent in trying to understand a concept like God.
And, there are just so many perspectives on this, right? I mean, you've got scientists, you've got theologians, you've got skeptics, philosophers, academics. I mean, the list goes on and on. But the source material we're looking at today is kind of coming from a unique angle, I think. It's evaluating all these proofs for God from a position that claims to already have what it considers the final answer, and that it'd make things interesting.
Right. It's assuming it already knows the answer, which is a really interesting place to start from. But we're going to approach it with a critical eye. We're going to really analyze whether this perspective holds up.
Yeah, we're going to dig into it. And, I think it's really important to emphasize here that we're really focusing on how we know, or, how we can't know. We're not just going to be saying, well, I believe this or I don't believe that. We're going to really try to dissect the epistemology of it all.
How do we know what we know?
Yeah, how do we know what we know about God? And a big part of that, a big part of our approach is going to be to avoid speculation. We're not going to be relying on belief systems or faith or dogma or ideology. We're also going to try to avoid just kind of pre-established paradigms like materialism or even a purely scientific lens.
Right, because without direct conscious experience of God, which is something we'll touch on later, those are often the only tools people have to grasp this concept.
And we want to try to avoid rationalization as well, because it's so easy to just kind of fall back on, well, this makes sense to me, so it must be true, and we're really trying to go deeper than that.
Yeah, to push past our own biases.
So the big question here, I think, and the question that we're really going to be wrestling with is this: why is it so hard to understand what God is, or to know that God exists? It seems kind of counterintuitive, right? I mean, if God is this all-powerful, all-knowing, incredible being, then why is it so hard to just prove that God's there? Why wouldn't it be obvious?
It's almost like, if God is so significant, why is God so hidden?
Yeah, and then there's this whole other layer of trying to reconcile all these different aspects of God, all the facets, all the properties. I mean, it seems like every religion, every tradition has its own unique set of attributes. That's something we're going to be exploring.
Right. So we're not just going to be looking at, the easy targets. We're going to try and steelman these arguments, even the ones that we might disagree with. And that brings up a really important principle of philosophical inquiry, which is avoiding rationalizations of pre-existing metaphysics.
It's so easy to fall into that trap, right? You start with a conclusion and then you just kind of cherry pick evidence to support it. But we want to try to be as objective as possible here. We want to really see where the arguments lead us, even if it takes us to some uncomfortable places.
Exactly. And we also need to be careful about how we use the word proof. We're not talking about absolute, undeniable proof, the kind of proof that would convince everyone. We're really talking about arguments, lines of reasoning, different ways of looking at the evidence.
Right. And even if we have a logically sound argument, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to convince everyone. There's psychology involved, there's sociology involved. I mean, people have all sorts of pre-existing beliefs and biases that can make it hard to to change their minds. And the ego plays a huge role in this too.
Oh, absolutely. The ego wants to be right. It wants to protect its beliefs.
So skepticism is going to be really important here. We need to question everything, even our own assumptions.
Question the assumptions underlying all these arguments, for sure.
Yeah, because if we're not willing to question our assumptions, then we're not really thinking critically, right? We're just accepting things at face value, and we want to go deeper than that.
And some of these arguments can be a bit complex. They might take a little bit of time to digest, so try not to dismiss them too quickly just because they sound weird or they don't immediately make sense.
Right, some of these ideas have been debated for centuries, so, we're not going to be able to resolve everything in an hour, but hopefully we can at least shed some light on some of these complex issues.
Absolutely.
So let's jump right in, shall we? Let's start with the cosmological argument.
Okay, so the cosmological argument basically goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe exists, therefore it must have a cause. This cause must be outside the universe, and it must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, and simple. And this cause, of course, is God.
Okay, so the first premise there, everything that begins to exist has a cause. I mean, that seems to make sense, right? I mean, we see cause and effect all the time in our everyday lives.
Right, it's a very intuitive idea.
But the thing that immediately jumps out at me is, can we really apply that principle to the universe itself? I mean, the universe is, well, it's everything, right? It's space-time, it's the laws of physics, it's everything. So can we really say that the same rules apply to the very beginning of the universe, to something that might be outside of space-time altogether?
That's the big question. Can we extrapolate these principles of causality that we see within the universe to something that's potentially outside of it? To something that may have created the universe. We don't know what the laws of physics were like before the Big Bang, if there even were any. So it's a big leap.
And the argument also says that the universe began to exist. But do we know that for sure? I mean, what if the universe is eternal? What if there was something before the Big Bang? What if the Big Bang was just one stage in an infinite cycle of expansion and contraction?
Exactly. We still don't fully understand the Big Bang, whether it was a true beginning or just a transition. And there are a lot of theories out there about what might have come before the Big Bang, if anything. So the idea that the universe definitely began to exist in a way that requires a cause, it's not something that everyone agrees on.
Okay, so let's say for the sake of argument that the universe did have a beginning, that it wasn't eternal. The cosmological argument that says that there can't be an infinite chain of causes. It can't be turtles all the way down. There has to be a first cause, an uncaused cause. But why? Why can't there be an infinite chain of causes?
Well, the traditional argument against infinite redress, which is what an infinite chain of causes is called, is that it doesn't really explain anything. If every cause needs a cause and that cause needs a cause and so on, then it's like, well, where did it all start? What was the first domino that fell? It seems like it's just pushing the problem back further and further.
Right. It's kind of like saying, well, who created God?
Exactly. But some philosophers argue that an infinite chain of causes isn't actually a problem. Maybe the chain itself is the fundamental reality. Maybe it's always existed. And maybe asking what caused the chain is like, asking what's north of the North Pole.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
It's a category error.
So let's grant for the sake of argument that there has to be a first cause, an uncaused cause. The cosmological argument then goes on to describe this cause. It says it has to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, simple. I mean, it's basically a list of all the things that the universe isn't. But does that really tell us anything about what this cause is? I mean, it could be anything, right?
It could be a void, it could be a fundamental law of nature, it could be a quantum fluctuation, it could be any number of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a conscious being, like the God of traditional religion.
Right, it could be completely impersonal.
And the argument itself doesn't really give us any positive attributes for this cause, it just tells us what it's not.
So the cosmological argument is, it's interesting, but it doesn't seem to get us very far in terms of actually proving the existence of a specific God, right?
It raises more questions than it answers, I think.
Yeah. But it does not light the difficulty of trying to apply our limited human understanding of cause and effect to something as vast and mysterious as the origin of the universe.
For sure.
All right, so let's move on to the next argument, the argument from the Big Bang. Now, this one seems to be pretty popular with people from certain religious backgrounds, people who see the Big Bang as a kind of scientific confirmation of their creation myths.
Right. The argument basically says that the Big Bang was a creation event and that this event had to have been caused by God.
But there are a few problems with this argument, right? I mean, first of all, it assumes that these religious texts are scientifically accurate, which is a pretty big assumption.
Yeah, and even if they are, our scientific understanding of the Big Bang is constantly evolving. We're learning new things all the time. And it's not clear that the Big Bang was really a beginning in the sense that, there was nothing before it.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of scientists who think that the Big Bang was just one stage in a much larger process, maybe a cyclical universe or something like that.
Exactly. And some even think that the Big Bang wasn't a creation from nothing at all. That there was something before it, something that we just don't understand yet.
So it seems like trying to force fit scientific discoveries into ancient religious narratives is kind of a dangerous game, right? It can lead to all sorts of misinterpretations.
It's important to remember that science and religion are trying to answer different kinds of questions. Science is about understanding the natural world, how things work. Religion is more about meaning and purpose. Why are we here? What's the point of it all?
Right. And they both have their own methods, their own ways of arriving at knowledge.
Exactly.
Okay, so the argument from the Big Bang it's interesting, but it doesn't seem to be a very strong argument for the existence of God, at least not in the way that it's often presented. So let's move on to the next one, the something from nothing argument. Now, this one is really simple, right? It just says something cannot come from nothing. The universe exists, therefore something must have created it, and that something is God.
Right. It sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, but it rests on this assumption that something can't come from nothing. And that might be true for our everyday experience. We don't see things just popping into existence out of nowhere. But the origin of the universe it's not an everyday experience, right? It's a singularity. It's the point where all our laws of physics break down. So can we really say for sure that something can come from nothing in that context?
That's the big question. What do we even mean by nothing in this context? I mean, is it even possible to conceive of true nothingness? And even if we can, do the same rules that apply to our everyday experience apply to the universe as a whole? I mean, maybe the universe is an exception to the rule. Maybe it's the one thing that can come from nothing.
Right. And even if something can't come from nothing, it doesn't necessarily mean that God is the only explanation, right? I mean, what if nothing is actually the source of everything? What if nothing is more like a field of pure potentiality, and the universe just kind of emerged from that?
That's getting pretty far out there, but it's an interesting idea to think about.
It is, isn't it? I mean, it really makes you question what we even mean by something and nothing.
Exactly. And our language is so limited when it comes to talking about these kinds of ultimate questions.
All right, so let's move on to the ontological argument. This one's a bit more abstract, bit more philosophical.
It's a classic. It basically goes like this. God is defined as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, if God existed only in our minds and not in reality, then we could conceive of something greater, a being identical to God but also existing in reality. Therefore, to be truly that than which nothing greater can be conceived, God must necessarily exist in reality.
So the argument is basically saying that existence is a perfection, and that a perfect being must necessarily exist.
Exactly.
But is that really true? I mean, can we just define God into existence like that? I mean, just because we can imagine something, does that mean it has to exist?
That's the million-dollar question. A lot of philosophers have criticized the ontological argument for this very reason. They say that existence is not a property in the same way that, say, being powerful or being intelligent is a property. You can't just add existence to the list of God's attributes and suddenly God exists.
Right? It's like, I can imagine a perfect island, with white sand beaches and palm trees and crystal clear water. But that doesn't mean that such an island actually exists somewhere.
Exactly. And even if we accept that existence is a perfection, it still doesn't follow that a perfect being must exist. There could be all sorts of reasons why a perfect being wouldn't or couldn't exist.
Right. I mean, maybe the universe just isn't set up that way. Maybe there's some fundamental law of reality that prevents perfect beings from existing. Or maybe the very concept of a perfect being is just incoherent. And maybe it's logically impossible for something to be perfect in every way.
And there's the question of, even if God is infinite and possesses all properties, does that mean that God has to exist? Because if God possesses all properties, that would include contradictory properties, which seems to be a problem logically.
Yeah, I mean, can something be both infinite and finite? Can something be both good and evil?
Right. It starts to get a bit messy.
So the ontological argument is, it's clever, it's thought-provoking, But it doesn't seem to be a very convincing proof of God's existence, does it?
It's more of a thought experiment than a proof, I think.
Yeah, but it does highlight the difficulty of trying to define God, to pin down this concept that seems to be so elusive.
For sure.
All right, let's move on to Descartes' causal argument. Now, Descartes was a big fan of the ontological argument, but he also came up with his own argument for God's existence. And this one is based on the idea that we have an idea of a perfect being, and that this idea must have a cause.
Right. Descartes argued that we can't create the idea of a perfect being ourselves because we're imperfect. So the idea must have come from somewhere else, from something that is itself perfect, and that something is God.
But couldn't the idea of God just come from, our culture, our upbringing, the books we read, the people we talk to? I mean, those are all causes, right?
That's a good point, but Descartes would say that those are just proximate causes. They're just the immediate things that bring the idea to mind. But the ultimate cause, the thing that created the idea in the first place, must be something perfect.
And Descartes also said that an effect can't be greater than its cause. So the idea of a perfect being must have been caused by something that is at least as perfect as the idea itself. And since we're imperfect, we couldn't have caused that idea.
Right. It's like, a candle can't produce more light than it already has.
But again, couldn't our brains, even though they're imperfect, still be capable of generating the idea of a perfect being? I mean, our brains are incredibly complex, right? They can create all sorts of amazing things, like art and music and literature.
And there's the unicorn argument. Our brains can imagine things that don't exist, things that are even more real in a way than our brains are, like a unicorn. So why couldn't our brains imagine God?
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, maybe we're not as separate from God as Descartes thought we were. Maybe the idea of God is somehow already present within us. Maybe it's part of our very nature.
Right. Some spiritual traditions would say that we're all part of God, that we're all connected to the divine in some way.
So Descartes' argument is, it's interesting, but it also rests on some pretty big assumptions about the nature of reality, about the nature of cause and effect, about the relationship between mind and world.
For sure. And like a lot of these arguments, it really comes down to your underlying metaphysical assumptions.
All right, let's move on to the teleological argument, or the argument from design. Now, this one is based on the idea that the universe looks like it was designed, like it was created by an intelligent being.
Right. Proponents of this argument look at the complexity of life, the beauty of nature, the fine-tuning of the universe, and they say, look, this couldn't have just happened by chance. There must be a designer behind it all.
And there's a certain intuitive appeal to this argument, right? I mean, when you look at the intricate workings of a cell, or the delicate balance of an ecosystem, or the sheer vastness of the cosmos, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe and wonder. And it's easy to think, well, there must be some intelligence behind this.
Right. But then along comes evolution and kind of throws a wrench in the works.
Yeah, because evolution provides a pretty compelling explanation for how all this complexity could have arisen without a designer.
Exactly. Evolution says that life on Earth gradually evolved over billions of years through a process of random mutation and natural selection. Random mutations introduce variation into a population, and then natural selection weed out the variations that are less fit to survive and reproduce.
So it's not that there's some intelligent being who's consciously designing all these amazing creatures. It's more like a blind process of trial and error, right? But over vast amounts of time, this blind process can produce incredibly complex and sophisticated results.
Right. It's almost like, if you had a monkey banging away on a typewriter for an infinite amount of time, eventually it would produce the complete works of Shakespeare.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. But even with evolution, there's still this question of where did it all start? Where did the first life come from? And that's where the God of the Gaps argument comes in, right?
Right. The God of the Gaps argument says that whenever science can't explain something, that's where God must be. So if science can explain the origin of life, then God must have created it.
But the problem with that argument is that science is always advancing, always finding new explanations for things. So if you base your belief in God on what science can't explain, then your belief is going to be constantly shrinking as science makes new discoveries.
Exactly. It's a moving target. And it also assumes that God is only involved in the gaps, that God's not involved in the things that science can explain.
Right. And some people might say, well, even if evolution explains how life developed, God could still have created the universe in such a way that evolution was bound to happen.
Right, that's the deistic perspective. God creates the universe and sets the laws of nature in motion and then steps back and lets everything unfold according to those laws.
So God is still the ultimate creator, but God's not actively involved in the day-to-day running of the universe.
Exactly.
And then there's the pantheistic perspective, which says that the universe itself is God.
Right, and pantheism, there's no separation between God and the universe. Everything is God and God is everything.
So evolution, from this perspective, is just God's way of creating and developing.
Right.
But if intelligent design is just another way of describing evolution, then what does it really mean to say that God is the designer?
That's a good question. It seems like it's just using the word God as a synonym for the universe or for the laws of nature.
Yeah, but some people might say, look, even if evolution can explain the development of life on Earth, it can't explain the fine-tuning of the universe.
Right. That's the fine-tuning argument, which says that the universe is so precisely calibrated for life that it couldn't have just happened by chance. There must have been a fine-tuner, and that fine-tuner is God.
But what about the anthropic principle? Doesn't that provide a non-theistic explanation for the fine-tuning?
The anthropic principle basically says that we observe this universe because it's the only kind of universe that we could observe. You know, if the universe weren't fine-tuned for life, then we wouldn't be here to observe it. So it's not really surprising that we find ourselves in a universe that's suitable for life.
Right, it's kind of like, if you win the lottery, it's not that surprising that you won, because if you hadn't won, you wouldn't be thinking about it.
Exactly. But proponents of the fine-tuning argument say that the anthropic principle doesn't explain everything. They say that the universe is just too perfectly fine-tuned for life for it to be just a coincidence.
And the source material even says that, after you realize God, this argument becomes even more convincing.
Right. It's saying that the fine-tuning isn't just a random accident. It's a sign of God's intelligence, God's creativity. And once you realize God, you can see this intelligence, this creativity everywhere you look.
So the fine-tuning argument it's a tough one, right? It's hard to know what to make of it, but it does make you think about the nature of the universe, about the possibility of a designer.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on to Aristotle's proof from movement. Now, Aristotle was a Greek philosopher, and he came up with a bunch of different arguments for God's existence. And this one is based on the idea that everything that moves is moved by something else.
Right, and Aristotle said that this chain of movers can't go on forever. There has to be a first mover, something that sets everything else in motion, and that first mover is God.
So it's kind of like a cosmic games of billiards, right? One ball hits another ball, which hits another ball, and so on. But there has to be someone who breaks the rack, right? Someone who sets the first ball in motion.
Exactly. But again, there are problems with this argument. I mean, first of all, why can't the chain of movers go on forever? Maybe the universe is just eternally in motion.
Right. Maybe there's no beginning, no first mover.
And thinking of all, what about things like inertia? Once an object is in motion, it tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So it doesn't need a constant mover to keep it going.
And what about things like gravity and magnetism? Those are forces that act at a distance. There's no direct contact between the objects. So it's not like one object is physically pushing or pulling on another object.
And some people might say that the Big Bang was the first mover, that it set the universe in motion, but then you still have to explain what caused the Big Bang.
Right, you just push the problem back a step.
Exactly.
So Aristotle's argument is, it's interesting historically, but it doesn't really hold up to modern scientific scrutiny.
It's a product of its time, for sure.
All right, let's move on to St. Augustine. Now, Augustine was a Christian theologian, and he came up with a whole bunch of different arguments for God's existence. And the first one we're going to look at is his proof from eternal truths.
Okay, so Augustine noticed that there are certain truths that seem to be eternal and unchanging, like the truths of mathematics and logic. 2 + 2 = 4 no matter what. And he said that these truths can't be explained by the material world because the material world is constantly changing. So there must be something else, something outside of the material world that grounds these eternal truths. And that something is God.
So Augustine is basically saying that God is the source of truth, the ultimate foundation of all knowledge.
Right, and he's also saying that these eternal truths point to a reality that's beyond our physical senses, a reality that's spiritual or divine.
But couldn't these eternal truths just be, inherent features of the universe itself? maybe math and logic are just built into the fabric of reality.
That's a possibility. And some people would say that math and logic are just human inventions. They're just ways of thinking about the world that we've created.
Right, they're not necessarily objective truths. They're just tools that we use to understand the world.
Exactly. But Augustine would say that these truths are too perfect, too universal to be just human inventions. They must have come from somewhere else, from something higher.
So Augustine's argument is it's interesting, but it also relies on some pretty big assumptions about the nature of truth, about the relationship between mind and world.
It does.
Okay, let's move on to Augustine's second proof, his proof from the hierarchy of goodness.
Okay, so Augustine noticed that we humans have a sense of good and bad, right? We make moral judgments all the time. And he said that this sense of good and bad implies that there's some standard of perfect goodness that we're comparing things to. We wouldn't be able to say that something is good unless we knew what good was. And that standard of perfect goodness is God.
So Augustine is basically saying that God is the source of morality, the ultimate standard of right and wrong.
Right.
But what if our sense of good and bad is just, a product of our evolution, our culture, our upbringing? Yeah, maybe it's not objective, maybe it's just relative.
That's a big debate in philosophy, but Augustine would say that even if our sense of good and bad is influenced by our culture and upbringing, there's still something underlying it, some ultimate standard that we're all trying to live up to.
And even if there is an objective standard of goodness, it doesn't necessarily mean that God is the source of that standard, right? I mean, maybe goodness is just, built into the fabric of reality.
Or maybe it's something that we as humans create, through our interactions with each other.
Right.
But Augustine would say that if goodness is just a human invention, then it's not really binding on us, right? We could just decide to change the rules whenever we want. And that doesn't seem right. It seems like there's something more to it, something that transcends our individual whims.
Yeah, there does seem to be something more to it, doesn't it? But it's hard to pin down what that something is.
It is.
All right, let's move on to Aquinas. Now, Aquinas was a medieval philosopher and theologian, and he's probably best known for his 5 ways, which are 5 different arguments for God's existence. Let's start with Aquinas' teleological proof. It's this classic argument that starts with the observation that natural bodies, like the moon, seem to act towards ends or purposes, even though they don't possess intelligence in the way we typically think of it.
Right, so think about the moon orbiting the Earth. It's following a very precise path, right? It's not like the moon is consciously deciding to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And so the second step in the argument is that anything that acts towards an end but doesn't have intelligence itself must be directed by an intelligence outside of itself.
Like an arrow needing an archer to guide it towards its target.
Right. And then, of course, that directing intelligence is identified as God.
So, right off the bat, you can see how this argument hinges on that first step, on whether we can truly say that natural bodies act towards ends without intelligence. Gura really pushes us to question what we even mean by intelligence here.
Yeah, that's a key point. He's not just accepting the traditional definition. He's saying, well, maybe there's a broader way to understand intelligence. Maybe it's not just limited to conscious beings.
Right. He talks about the idea of intelligence as a kind of inherent order in the universe. So the predictability and consistency of the moon's orbit, the fact that it follows these precise laws of physics, could be seen as a manifestation of an underlying intelligence.
So even if the moon itself isn't thinking, the fact that it's behaving in such an ordered way suggests that something intelligent might have set it up that way.
Exactly, and he takes this further with the analogy of a car, right? We see a car and we immediately recognize it as an intelligent creation because its parts are all arranged in a very specific way to achieve a purpose that was designed by an intelligent engineer.
Right. So the argument is, well, isn't the universe kind of like that? It's incredibly complex, all these different parts working together in this intricate way that allows for life to exist. Doesn't that suggest a kind of cosmic engineer, an intelligent designer behind it all?
Yeah, that's the core of the teleological argument. And Gura doesn't shy away from the challenges to this idea. He brings up the multiverse hypothesis as a possible naturalistic explanation for this apparent design.
Right, the idea that maybe our universe is just one of an infinite number of universes, all with different laws of physics, and we just happen to be in the one that's conducive to life.
Exactly. So it's not necessarily that someone designed our universe specifically for us, but rather that within an infinite number of universes, it's statistically inevitable that some universes would have the right conditions for life to arise.
So it becomes a question of probability. And Gura also explores the possibility that maybe even this brute force creation of universes, if that's what's happening, could itself be considered a form of intelligence in a very abstract sense. I mean, if every possible configuration of a universe is out there and ours is the one that works, isn't there a kind of logic or necessity to its emergence?
He really pushes the boundaries of how we think about intelligence and causality. And he acknowledges that we don't have all the answers here. We're dealing with questions that are ultimately beyond the scope of current science.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the Neoplatonic proof, which takes a different approach. This one focuses on the concept of unity.
Right. It starts with the observation that the material world we experience is characterized by multiplicity, meaning that there are countless individual things.
Trees, rocks, stars, galaxies, you name it.
Exactly. And then the argument goes that all this multiplicity must have its source in an absolute unity, something singular from which all this diversity originates.
So to have parts, you must first have a whole.
Right. And this absolute unity, the source of all being, is identified as God. But here's the catcher. This God, this absolute unity, is said to be beyond our human categories of being, intellect, and even definition itself.
Beyond being. What does that even mean?
Yeah, it's getting pretty abstract here. It means that this unity is not just another thing that exists. It's more like the ground of existence itself. It's what makes existence possible.
Okay, but if it's beyond definition, if we can't even describe it, how is it different from just nothingness?
That's a really good question. And Gura doesn't shy away from that challenge. He acknowledges that this Neoplatonic conception of God can seem very close to just a void, an emptiness. But the argument is that this unity, even though it's beyond our grasp, is what gives rise to all the multiplicity and diversity we see in the world.
It's like the ultimate source of everything, but it's so fundamental that it's almost invisible to us.
Right. And Gura points out that even the idea of a multiverse, which we talked about earlier, doesn't necessarily contradict this notion of absolute unity. I mean, even if there are multiple universes, what is it that's holding them all? What's the structure that allows for their existence?
So it's like pushing the question back a level. Even if we have many, what is the many arising from?
Exactly. And the Neoplatonic answer is that it ultimately arises from this absolute unity, this God that's beyond our comprehension. But the question of how to reconcile this very abstract and seemingly impersonal God with the more personal God of religious traditions, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, that's a big one. Okay, let's move on to the moral argument, which is probably one of the most common arguments for the existence of God.
Yeah.
People often appeal to the idea that there are objective moral truths, and that these truths can only exist if there's a God to ground them.
Right. The idea is that without God, morality would just be subjective, a matter of personal opinion or cultural norms. So you wouldn't really be able to say that anything is truly right or wrong.
But Gura doesn't just accept this premise. He challenges it right from the start. He says, well, do we really have good reason to believe that objective moral truths exist?
He points out that different cultures and societies have had vastly different moral codes throughout history. What's considered morally acceptable in one place or time might be considered abhorrent in another.
Yeah, that's a good point. It makes you wonder if maybe morality is more of a human invention than a divine decree.
Exactly. And Gura argues that even if there are objective moral truths, they don't necessarily have to come from God. He suggests that morality could arise from reason and empathy. We can understand that causing suffering is bad and that helping others is good without needing a divine being to tell us that.
So it's like saying that we can figure out what's right and wrong based on our own understanding of the world and our capacity for compassion.
Right. And he also addresses that classic is ought problem, the idea that you can't derive moral values from just facts about the world. Science can tell us what is, but it can't tell us what ought to be.
So science can describe the effects of, say, pollution, but it can't tell us whether pollution is morally wrong. That's a value judgment that seems to come from somewhere else.
Exactly. But Gura again challenges the assumption that this somewhere else has to be God. He says, well, maybe our moral sense comes from our evolution as social creatures. Maybe it's rooted in our need to cooperate and live together harmoniously.
So maybe morality is more about what works for us as a species, what allows us to thrive and survive.
Right. And he even uses the example of animals to make this point. He says, do you think that a wolf sharing food with its pack is doing it because it has a conscious awareness of God's goodness? Or is it more likely that it's acting on instinct, on something that's been ingrained in its nature through evolution?
It's an interesting thought experiment. It makes you question whether human morality is really so unique and whether it requires a divine explanation.
Yeah. But then, Gura brings it back to his idea that reality is fundamentally consciousness. If that's the case, and intelligence is an inherent aspect of this consciousness, then even atheists who derive their morality from reason are, in a sense, participating in that divine consciousness, even if they don't realize it.
So they might be tapping into a source of goodness that they don't even recognize as God.
Right. It's a very different way of thinking about the relationship between morality and the divine.
Okay, let's move on to the argument from reason and intelligibility. This one is about the remarkable fact that we, as humans, are able to understand the universe, to make sense of it through logic and reason.
Right. We can develop scientific theories, mathematical equations, all these tools that allow us to grasp the workings of the cosmos. And the argument is that this intelligibility of the universe points towards a rational foundation to reality itself.
And that rational foundation is identified as God.
Exactly. But Gura challenges the typical naturalistic explanation for our rationality, which is that it's simply a product of the brain, an evolutionary adaptation that helped us survive. He calls this a sneaky assumption and offers a different perspective based on his understanding of consciousness.
Right. It's a pretty radical idea, but it makes you think about what it is that allows us to have a coherent experience of the world in the first place.
Right. Okay, ready for another argument?
Bring it on. What's next?
The argument from information theory.
All right, lay it on us.
This one starts with the observation that DNA contains coded information, much like language or computer code.
Yeah, the idea that the genetic code is like a set of instructions that tells cells how to build and maintain an organism.
Exactly. And then the argument goes that information theory tells us that complex codes like this always originate from conscious minds, not from random processes.
So just like we don't expect a Shakespearean sonnet to arise spontaneously from a random jumble of letters, we shouldn't expect the genetic code to have arisen from random chemical reactions.
Right. The argument is that there must have been an intelligent mind behind it, a designer who created this code.
And that designer, of course, is God. But where does Gura see the potential weaknesses in this line of reasoning?
Well, he points out that the claim that all code come from minds is potentially question-begging. Our main experience with information creation comes from humans who, according to the scientific view, evolved through natural processes.
So we're using an example of something that arose through evolution to argue that something else, the genetic code, couldn't have arisen through evolution.
A bit circular, right?
Yeah, I see the problem there. It's like saying that because we've only ever seen birds build nests, then all nests, including those built by insects, must have been built by birds.
Exactly. And Gura suggests that life itself, with its incredibly complex genetic code, might be the very example of a code arising through an undirected, but not necessarily random, process. He proposes that the intelligence might be inherent in the fundamental laws of physics and chemistry, driving the emergence of life and its complex information systems.
So the intelligence isn't in a separate designer, but in the very fabric of the universe itself.
Right. Okay, let's tackle the argument from free will. This one is a classic.
Yeah, the idea that our ability to make choices freely, to act independently of deterministic causes, points towards a source beyond the material world, a source that can account for this freedom.
And that source is, you guessed it, God. But Gura, as you might expect, doesn't let this one slide without some serious scrutiny.
So where does he start poking holes?
Well, right off the bat, he says that this argument assumes the very thing it's trying to prove, the existence of free will. He points out that the idea of free will is itself a very contentious issue in philosophy. There's a strong argument to be made that all our actions are actually determined by prior causes, by the laws of physics and the events that came before.
So maybe our sense of free will is just an illusion.
Right. And if that's the case, then the whole argument for God based on free will falls apart.
Because there's nothing to explain.
Yeah.
But even if we grant that some form of free will exists, Gura says it doesn't automatically follow that it has to come from God.
Right. There could be other explanations, other ways to account for non-deterministic processes in the universe. But then Gura throws a real curveball. He argues that from an awakened perspective, God, as absolute existence, actually implies complete determinism and the absence of free will.
Wait, so he's saying that God and free will are actually incompatible? That's the opposite of what most people think?
It is. But his reasoning is that if God is truly absolute, if God is everything, then there's no room for anything outside of God to make truly independent choices. Everything that happens is, in a sense, a necessary expression of God's nature.
So our sense of free will might be a limited perspective from within this larger deterministic framework of absolute existence.
Right. It's a pretty mind-bending idea.
Yeah, that one takes some time to wrap your head around. Okay, let's move on to the argument from consciousness, which is another one that points to the limitations of a purely materialistic worldview.
Right. The argument is that the very existence of subjective consciousness, of our inner experience of awareness and feeling, can't be adequately explained by just material processes.
It's that classic hard problem of consciousness, right? How do you get from neurons firing to the feeling of what it's like to experience the world?
Exactly. And this argument suggests that there must be something more, something non-material to account for consciousness, and that something is often identified as God.
So consciousness becomes evidence for a divine realm, a source beyond the material world. But how does Gura approach this one?
Well, he definitely agrees that consciousness is a huge mystery, and he doesn't think materialism has adequately addressed it, but he takes it a step further. He says that from his perspective, the universe is consciousness. God is consciousness.
So it's not that consciousness points to God, it's that consciousness is God.
Exactly. And he points out the irony of atheists using their own consciousness to argue against God, when consciousness itself, in this view, is the very thing they should be recognizing as divine.
It's a powerful point.
Yeah.
But he also acknowledges that this understanding of consciousness as fundamental isn't something you just arrive at through ordinary thinking. It often requires a kind of awakening, a shift in perspective.
Right. It's not just an intellectual concept, it's a lived experience.
Okay, let's talk about the argument from Scripture, which is probably one of the most familiar arguments for many people. This is the idea that holy books, like the Bible or the Quran, are divinely inspired and therefore provide evidence for God's existence.
Right. Some people point to the beauty or the wisdom contained in these texts, or the fact that they seem to have predicted certain events as proof of their divine origin.
So the logic is basically, Scripture says God exists, therefore God exists.
Yeah, and Gura points out the obvious problem with this. It's circular reasoning. You're using the text itself to prove its own authority.
It's like saying, this book is true because it says it's true.
Exactly. And Gura emphasizes that all scriptures were written by humans, people living in particular historical and cultural contexts. Even if there was some divine inspiration involved, it had to be filtered through the minds and the language of these human authors.
Right, so there's always the possibility of misinterpretation, of human error, of biases creeping in.
And there's also the question of historical accuracy. Many of the events described in scriptures are very difficult, if not impossible, to verify independently.
So it's not like we can just take the text at face value and assume that everything it says is literally true.
Right. And Gura goes even further, suggesting that even if God does exist, our scripturally derived ideas about God are likely to be flawed and incomplete.
Because they're limited by our human understanding and the specific cultural lens through which they were written.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to the argument from popularity, which is basically the idea that the widespread belief in God throughout history and across cultures provides evidence for God's existence.
Right. The thinking is that such a widespread and enduring belief couldn't possibly be a mere delusion. There must be something to it.
So the sheer number of believers becomes an argument in itself.
Yeah, but Gura cautions against equating popularity with truth. He points out that self-deception is very common, and large groups of people have been wrong about things before.
Think about all the times in history when the majority believed something that turned out to be false.
Exactly. So just because a lot of people believe in God doesn't automatically make it true. But Gura does offer a more nuanced perspective here. He suggests that the persistence of this belief might point to a real underlying truth, even if the specific interpretations and beliefs about God are often misguided.
So it's like there's a kernel of truth there, a deep intuition about something beyond the material world, but that intuition gets dressed up in different cultural clothes, so to speak.
Right. It's not proof, but it's something to consider.
Okay, what about the argument from the success of religion? Some people argue that the fact that religion has been so influential and enduring throughout history, providing meaning, community, and moral guidance, suggests that it must be tapping into some real truths, including the truth of God's existence.
Right. The idea is that if it wasn't based on something true, it wouldn't have been so successful. But Gura offers a more functionalist explanation. He suggests that religion's success might be due to its ability to fulfill certain basic human needs.
The need for meaning, purpose, belonging, a sense of order in the world.
Exactly. These are things that are important for human flourishing, regardless of whether the specific beliefs of a religion are literally true. But again, Gura adds a deeper layer to this. He suggests that the initial success and the enduring appeal of some religions might be connected to the profound insights of the awakened individuals who founded them.
So there might have been some genuine spiritual experiences, some deep truths that were grasped by these founders, but then those truths got kind of codified and institutionalized, and maybe even distorted over time.
Right. And so the success of religion might be a combination of those original insights and the social and psychological benefits it provides.
It's a complex picture.
Definitely.
Okay, let's move on to the argument from perennial philosophy, which is the idea that there are certain common themes and ideas that run through various mystical and spiritual traditions across cultures and throughout history.
Right. These commonalities suggest that there's a shared underlying truth that transcends the specific doctrines of any one tradition.
So even though different religions might have different deities or rituals or beliefs, there's a kind of deeper level where they converge.
Exactly. And Gura points to concepts like the idea of a transcendent reality, the illusory nature of the ego, the importance of direct experience, and the possibility of awakening or enlightenment. These are themes that you find in various forms in Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Sufism, and many other traditions.
So it's like there's a kind of universal wisdom that's been expressed in different ways throughout human history.
Right. And Gura doesn't claim that this is definitive proof of God, but he does find it to be a very compelling phenomenon. It challenges the idea that all religious and spiritual experiences are just cultural constructs or delusions.
It suggests that maybe there's something more to it, something that's pointing towards a deeper reality.
Okay, let's talk about the argument from faith. This one is about the idea that blind faith in God is not only necessary, but is actually a virtue.
Yeah, the idea that God wants us to believe without needing proof, that it's a test of our faith.
Right. But Gura is very critical of this argument. He strongly advises against blind faith.
He's all about skeptical inquiry, about using reason and critical thinking to get to the truth.
Exactly. He believes that if God exists, then honest questioning should be encouraged, not discouraged. He doesn't think God would punish us for wanting to understand.
Okay, let's look at Pascal's wager, which is kind of a pragmatic argument for believing in God. The idea is that even if you're not sure if God exists, it's still in your best interest to believe, because the potential reward is infinite, eternal life in heaven, and the potential risk is also infinite, eternal damnation in hell.
Right, so it's like a cost-benefit analysis of belief.
But Gura finds a lot of problems with this line of reasoning.
Yeah, he points out that it's a very self-serving and transactional view of faith. It's like you're making a bet with God, hoping to win the jackpot.
Not exactly the most spiritually pure motivation.
Right. And it also assumes that you're only choosing between believing in the Christian God or not believing at all. But there are so many other possibilities, other conceptions of God, other religious systems.
So you could be betting on the wrong horse, so to speak.
Exactly. And Gura also questions whether you can really force yourself to believe something just because you think it's in your best interest. Belief usually comes from conviction, from feeling like something is true, not just from wanting it to be true.
Okay, let's talk about the argument from mystery, or what's often called the God of the Gaps argument. This is the idea that whenever science encounters something it can't explain, we should just plug God into that gap.
Right, so it's like saying, well, we don't know how the universe began, therefore God must have created it.
Or, we don't fully understand consciousness, therefore God must be the source of consciousness.
Exactly. And Gura's critique of this is pretty straightforward. He says it's basing belief on ignorance. As science progresses, those gaps in our knowledge inevitably get filled with naturalistic explanations.
So, your God keeps getting smaller and smaller as science advances.
Right. And Gura says that a true understanding of God shouldn't be based on what we don't know, but on something much more fundamental.
Okay, let's move on to the argument from religious and mystical experience. This one is about the idea that people have direct experiences of the divine, whether it's through near-death experiences, meditation, psychedelics, or just moments of profound insight or connection.
Right. And these experiences are often so powerful and transformative that they lead people to believe in a higher power, in God.
So it's not about reasoning or arguing, it's about having a first-hand encounter with something that feels sacred or transcendent.
Exactly. And Gura actually gives this argument more weight than many of the others we've discussed. He believes that direct experience is the most reliable way of knowing.
Because you're not relying on someone else's interpretation, you're having your own direct encounter.
Right. But he also acknowledges that there are challenges with interpreting these experiences. They're often very subjective, difficult to describe to others, and they can be influenced by our pre-existing beliefs and expectations.
So it's not always easy to know what to make of them, to distinguish between a genuine experience of the divine and, say, a psychological phenomenon.
Exactly. And Gura emphasizes the importance of being cautious and discerning when it comes to these experiences.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about the argument for miracles. This is the idea that reports of miraculous events, things that seem to defy the laws of nature, provide evidence for God's intervention in the world.
Right, like healings that can't be explained medically or objects appearing or disappearing mysteriously.
So these events are seen as proofs that God is real and that he can act in the world in ways that transcend our normal understanding.
Yeah, but Gura finds this argument to be pretty weak. He points out that most people haven't personally witnessed a miracle. We're usually relying on the reports of others, often from long ago, and there's always the possibility of exaggeration or misinterpretation.
Right, it's like playing a game of telephone. The story can change a lot in the retelling. And even if something genuinely unexplainable did happen, that doesn't automatically prove that it was caused by God. There could be other explanations.
Exactly. But Gura does offer an interesting twist on this. He suggests that spiritual awakening itself, that radical transformation of consciousness, can be seen as the ultimate miracle.
Because it's a kind of inexplicable shift in your experience of reality, a direct encounter with a deeper truth.
Right.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Gura's exploration of these philosophical arguments for God's existence, I think one of the key takeaways is the importance of being aware of our own epistemological and metaphysical assumptions.
Absolutely. We all come to these questions with certain beliefs about the nature of reality and how we can know things. And those beliefs inevitably shape how we interpret these arguments and the evidence we find convincing.
Right. And Gura encourages us to be honest about those assumptions, to question them, and to be open to the possibility that our current understanding might be limited.
He really emphasizes the difference between direct experience and indirect knowledge.
Right. It's one thing to believe something because you've read about it in a book or heard someone else say it. It's another thing entirely to experience it for yourself, to have a direct encounter with whatever it is you're seeking to understand.
Exactly.
And Gura acknowledges that when it comes to something as profound and mysterious as God, we're all, in a sense, in a state of not knowing. Even those who believe in God can't fully grasp or define what God is.
Right. And he suggests that truly understanding God, if that's even possible, might require a fundamental shift in our consciousness, a kind of awakening.
And he ends this section with a long list of problematic assumptions that people often make when talking about God, just to highlight how complex this topic is and how easy it is to fall into traps of thinking.
Right. He talks about assuming that the properties of finite things apply to an infinite God, assuming that the laws of the universe apply outside of the universe, assuming that our limited human perspective gives us a complete picture of reality, and so on. It's a really thought-provoking list.
Yeah, it definitely makes you question your own assumptions. Have you ever had a genuine, immediate, personal experience of God? Have you ever felt that presence?
That's the question, right? It bypasses all the dogma and the doctrine, and it's just like, have you encountered this?
That's it. It's not what you've read, not what you've been told, but in your experience, in your life, have you felt that undeniable presence, that connection that you'd call God?
And I think for most people, the answer is probably going to be no.
Right, and this is where things get a little bit tricky.
This is where the problems start.
Exactly, because what we're left with then are indirect claims. And these can be anything. Logical deductions, intuitions, beliefs that we have.
Hunches.
Hunches, yeah. Faith, maybe it's something we heard here say. Speculation, probability.
Justification.
Justifications are thoughts, theories, models. Gura lists a whole bunch of things.
He does. He's got a whole taxonomy of these indirect claims about God. And so if that direct personal revelation hasn't happened, then it seems like every argument we're making, every piece of evidence for or against God, it becomes inherently secondhand.
That's right. It's mediated through something else. It's mediated through our observation about the world. It's mediated through some powerful emotion or a chain of reasoning.
Right.
And Gura's really keen to point out that this reliance on indirect evidence opens the door for all sorts of potential misinterpretations and misunderstandings.
Oh, yeah. And this is where things get a little dangerous, I think. He says this is not the real thing, right?
He does. He says it's not the real thing.
And because it's not the real thing, it's an invitation for self-deception.
Exactly. And this is a warning to everyone. This isn't just for people who believe in God. This is for people who are skeptical of God's existence, for people who actively deny God's existence. It doesn't matter where you land on that spectrum. We are all prone to fooling ourselves with our interpretations.
Yeah, and I think he highlights this so well, the idea that he's not coming at this from a theist versus atheist perspective.
Not at all.
He's actually coming at this from the perspective of a fundamental human vulnerability that we have when we're dealing with information, especially information about something so abstract.
Absolutely.
And so potentially far removed from our everyday sensory experience.
Right. He even singles out feelings and intuitions. Yeah, the things that feel the most real to us.
Yeah.
Those things that speak to us inside. He says those are the things that are actually most susceptible to self-deception.
Yeah. Those are the areas that we really need to scrutinize most carefully.
We do.
He says this pervasive nature of self-deception, this is not just some side issue that he's talking about. This is central to his whole project.
It is.
This is a huge pillar in understanding why proving God is so difficult.
That's right.
Why proving anything profound and meaningful is difficult.
And in fact, a significant portion of his work is devoted to really understanding this, the mechanism of self-deception.
And how to mitigate it.
How to mitigate it.
Yeah. Okay, so if direct experience is rare and indirect evidence is so open to self-deception, what are we supposed to do? What does Gura recommend we actually do?
Okay, so instead of just going back and forth, argue about whether God exists or God doesn't exist, Gura says step back. Let's do something a little bit more fundamental, something he believes will actually be more productive, and that is to identify our own assumptions.
Oh.
So it doesn't matter if someone is arguing for theism or atheism. He says, ask them. Ask them what their underlying epistemic assumptions are, their metaphysical assumptions are.
Okay, I love that. Because instead of arguing about God, you're essentially going a level deeper, and you're talking about what are the assumptions we're even bringing to the table.
Exactly. So epistemic assumptions, that's what we believe about knowledge. How do we know things? What counts as knowledge?
Right.
Metaphysical assumptions, what do we believe about the nature of reality itself?
Okay, so what happens when people are asked to articulate those assumptions?
Well, he finds that most people, they really struggle with this.
They have no idea.
They have no idea. They haven't done the work to identify what these fundamental beliefs are.
Because they're not used to thinking that way.
Exactly. And when they're pressed, when they have to explain what these assumptions are, often what happens is their arguments start to fall apart.
They become defensive or flustered.
Absolutely. They don't know what to say.
Because they're realizing, oh, I've never actually thought about that.
I haven't thought about this.
That's so interesting.
And this is really crucial, right? It's saying, okay, well, the argument about God, any argument about God is only as strong as the foundation, the assumptions it's built upon.
Which are often invisible.
Invisible.
And so he's saying we've got to make those visible.
We do.
Now, he doesn't let anyone off the hook.
He doesn't.
He even calls out big names like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah.
He says that even these really influential thinkers, he suspects that they haven't adequately scrutinized their own assumptions.
He does.
And this is not him just attacking one side. He's saying on both sides, both theistic and atheistic viewpoints, they're often held by what he calls epistemological ignoramuses.
Yeah.
People who just don't really understand or haven't fully explored their frameworks of knowledge.
They just haven't done the work.
They haven't done the work. And so what I'm hearing is that a lot of these arguments about God, they're kind of top-heavy.
Top-heavy. That's a great way to put it.
They're built on shaky ground.
Absolutely.
Okay, so he talks about this tendency of people to argue backwards.
Yeah, this is a fascinating concept.
What does he mean by arguing backwards?
So he says a lot of people who believe in God, they already have that belief, and then they kind of work backwards.
Yeah, they start with the conclusion and then they look for the evidence.
Exactly. And so they will selectively pick out arguments and evidence and data that will support their belief, that will confirm their belief.
Yeah, and he's saying, listen, just because you get to a conclusion that's true doesn't mean you got there in a valid way.
Doesn't mean you did the work.
Yeah, doesn't mean the process was sound.
That's right.
And so it's about the integrity of the process, not just about being right at the end.
Right.
Okay, so then he talks about the limits of what atheists and theists can actually know.
He does.
So let's start with the atheist side. What does he say about atheism?
He says atheists should acknowledge they do not know for certain that God does not exist.
Okay.
And he really pushes back against these probabilistic claims like, oh, I'm 90% sure God doesn't exist.
Yeah, he thinks those are bogus.
Yeah, and he says instead, the most intellectually honest position to take is to embrace this idea of not knowing.
Not knowing.
And this isn't a weakness.
Right.
This is about being really honest with yourself and saying, I don't have enough information. I cannot say for sure.
Because if I did, I'd be claiming to have this direct experience that we already talked about.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the atheist side. What about the theists?
Well, he says theists, they also need to do a little bit of self-reflection. He says things like scriptures and personal beliefs and faith. Those things, while they can be very meaningful, those things do not equate to knowing that God exists.
Unless you've had that direct experience.
Unless you've had that direct experience.
Right.
And so if you haven't had that, then again, you are fundamentally in a state of not knowing,
Right.
even if your faith is incredibly strong.
Yeah. Okay, so he's calling for epistemic humility across the board, saying we need to be honest about what we can and cannot know.
Absolutely.
And then he gets into this really interesting area, the idea of the rarity of understanding.
Yeah.
And he has this line where he talks about the corruption of language when we try to talk about God.
He does.
So first of all, what does he mean by the rarity of understanding? What does he mean by true understanding of God?
So he says that true understanding of God requires multiple awakenings.
Multiple awakenings.
And it requires this level of depth that he believes very few people actually attain.
Very, very few.
And he thinks that only a tiny fraction of people can really speak about what he calls the structure of God.
The structure of God.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they can only speak about it in a way that is clear and untainted by the limitations of our own minds.
That word untainted, what does he mean by that?
So this is where he gets into the idea of the corruption of language.
Yeah.
And he says that is the challenge.
Okay, so that leads us to what he identifies as really the crux of the issue, the influence of these hidden assumptions.
Right.
And he argues that this is where the real problem lies.
That's right. It's not that there's not enough evidence.
It's not that we need more data.
It's that we have all these hidden presuppositions that we're not even aware of.
Yeah, we're operating on a set of assumptions that we haven't even looked at.
Yeah. And these assumptions, they shape how we interpret anything,
Absolutely.
any potential evidence we come across.
And he's not saying you have to come out believing in God.
No.
But he's saying we need to cultivate this awareness
Yes.
of what are the underlying assumptions of whatever we're talking about.
Yeah, this isn't just about God.
This is about everything.
This is about everything.
Yeah.
This is about being able to think critically about any belief system.
About reality itself.
About reality itself.
Yeah. And this, he says, is the key to minimizing self-deception.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have these indirect, these corrupted ways of knowing,
Right.
and we're operating on a bunch of hidden assumptions.
We are.
So let's look at some of the assumptions that he talks about.
Okay, so he gives a huge list.
He does.
We're not going to go through every single one in detail,
But we're going to hit the highlights.
so we're going to hit the highlights.
Okay.
So one of the first ones he talks about is this tendency we have to apply the properties of finite objects.
So the things we interact with every day.
Things we can see and touch and measure. He says we try to apply those to God,
To this infinite concept.
to this infinite
Yeah.
concept.
Okay.
And he asks, is that even logically valid?
Right. Can we use the same framework for a chair or a planet to understand something that by definition is beyond limitations?
Right. So that brings into question a lot of the arguments about, cause and effect.
First cause.
First cause. Yeah.
The cosmological argument.
He says, wait a minute.
Does that even apply here?
Are we using the right tools?
Yeah. Okay, so he also talks about our assumptions, our unexamined assumptions about the universe.
Yeah.
So we observe laws and dynamics operating in the universe,
Right.
and we kind of just automatically assume that those must apply outside of the universe as well,
You do.
or to whatever caused the universe.
Yeah. And then there's this issue of having a sample size of one,
We only have one universe to look at as far as we know.
as far as we know.
So how can we make these grand pronouncements about how things must be when we're only working with one data point?
Yeah,
And then he talks about probabilities
he does.
and Bayesian logic and how we try to apply that to discussions about God.
Yeah, and he really takes issue with this.
Oh,
He says that the probability of God existing, it's 100%
as a tautology.
as a tautology.
Now, that's a head scratcher for some people.
It is.
So essentially what he's saying is, if you define God as ultimate reality, then ultimate reality, by definition, must exist.
Yeah. It's a matter of how we're defining these terms.
It's not a question of, throwing the dice.
It's not a 50% chance.
It's not a scientific experiment.
It's not.
Okay, so then he gets into all these assumptions about morality.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the areas where he really challenges people.
He does.
He says, can we even assume that there is such a thing as objective morality?
Right. If there is, does it have to apply to God?
Yeah, are we projecting our human ideas of right and wrong onto something much greater than ourselves?
Exactly.
Okay, and then the idea of, this benevolent God.
Yeah. This idea that God is good, God is loving, God would not deceive us.
That's what we want.
That's what we want God to be.
But can we assume that that's true?
Right. Gura actually suggests that maybe God deceives us.
Whoa.
He does.
Okay, we're going to have to unpack that one a little bit more.
Yeah, and even the idea that ultimate reality itself might be a form of infinite self-deception.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And then, all these other assumptions about God's designs fitting our needs.
Our little human needs.
Our little human needs and desires and morality.
Yeah, like God cares about our petty little dramas.
Yeah.
And then the idea that we can actually know God's attributes.
That we can put God in a box, define God.
That we can comprehend something so vast.
Right.
He says, is that even possible?
And he brings up the possibility of an evil God.
He does.
Which is a very uncomfortable idea for a lot of people.
It is.
But he says, how can we rule that out?
How can we?
If we haven't had that direct experience.
That's the question.
And he also talks about scriptures.
Right. A lot of people just assume scriptures are true.
They take them at face value.
They do.
And he's saying, well, hold on a second. Let's not just automatically assume that those are true.
Right. Let's examine those critically.
Let's apply the same scrutiny to those as we would to anything else.
Exactly. And then he talks about the need for God.
For the universe to exist.
Could the universe exist without God?
Yeah. He says, how do we know? And then the big one that a lot of people have trouble with, something can't come from nothing.
Right. This idea that there has to be a cause for everything.
Everything has to have a beginning.
Everything has to have a beginning.
And he even brings up the idea that maybe the universe itself has some sort of intelligence.
Yeah, maybe the universe is God.
Whoa.
It's a big idea.
Yeah.
So then he challenges these dualities that we cling to.
So God and the world.
Self and other.
Good and evil.
Yeah, he says, are these distinctions even real?
At the ultimate level.
Or are these just constructs that our human minds create to make sense of things?
To make reality manageable.
Exactly. And he questions this idea that we can prove God's existence.
Through logic.
Through logic.
Yeah.
Or using the scientific method.
Which is a tool designed for the physical world.
Exactly.
He says, is that the right tool to use for something that's inherently metaphysical?
And he does this really interesting thing where he flips the script.
And he turns it back on the atheists.
He says atheism has assumptions too.
Yeah. Don't think you're off the hook.
Don't think you're off the hook.
You have assumptions too. What are those assumptions?
Exactly.
So then he talks about free will.
Yeah. Do we actually have free will?
He says, how do we know the difference between something and nothing?
He loves to challenge that one.
Yeah.
One God versus many gods.
God and evolution.
Yeah.
Are those really separate things?
Could they be different expressions of the same underlying reality?
Yeah, different ways of understanding the same thing. Okay, so he also talks about science.
Yeah. He says, is science the ultimate arbiter of truth?
Can we assume that everything science tells us is 100% accurate?
Or is science itself also a limited perspective?
Yeah.
He talks about consciousness.
This is one of his favorite things to talk about.
He does.
Consciousness, he says. Can consciousness be generated solely by matter?
Yeah, or is there something more to it?
Something fundamental.
And then he even questions our belief in the external world.
This is where it gets trippy.
This is where it gets trippy.
Solipsism.
The idea that maybe it's all just my mind.
Yeah.
There's nothing outside of my experience.
How do we know?
How do we know?
And he says, can we assume that ultimate reality is sane?
Yeah.
Using our human definition of sanity.
Our limited human definition, right.
And then going even deeper, he talks about, can we even use these concepts of proof and logic?
Yeah. Do those things even apply when you're talking about something like God?
Right. And can we conceptualize God?
Yeah, can our little human minds wrap themselves around something so vast?
Right. Can
Yeah.
we accurately describe God as an object or a thing?
Yeah. Can we put God in a box?
Right. Can we quantify God? Can we formalize God? Can we objectify God? Can we run experiments on God?
Can we put God under a microscope?
And he says, is God even good?
He says, can we assume that?
Yeah, we assume it. Can we?
And can we communicate about God?
Using these limited tools.
Using this corrupted language.
Right.
And then he gets into some very specific religious assumptions.
Yeah.
The idea that, God is Christian.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Or that God fits neatly into any specific tradition or religious box.
Right.
And he challenges the validity of applying any categories or dualities to ultimate reality.
Yeah, he says that maybe those categories, those boxes, those are all constructs of our minds.
Yeah, maybe they're not ultimately real.
And then he questions, does God even fully know itself?
That's a good one.
Does God have one form?
Only one.
He says, how do we know? And then he brings in some scientific ideas, like the Big Bang.
He says, can we assume that the Big Bang actually happened the way that scientists describe it? Right. Are we taking that as gospel, so to speak?
He also challenges this idea that the physical laws that we observe in the universe, that those apply everywhere.
That they're universal and unchanging.
Exactly.
And then he has to address this assumption that a lot of people have that metaphysics is meaningless.
Yeah, a lot of people just think, why are we even bothering with this?
This is a waste of time.
It's all just speculation.
It's all just made up.
Yes.
And he pushes back against that.
He does.
And then to come full circle, he questions whether God can be known at all.
Yeah. He doesn't want to rule out the possibility that maybe we can know God, but we're just not using the right tools.
Or we haven't figured out how yet.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that list of assumptions, that's just a whirlwind tour of the assumptions that he presents.
It is.
And the point is not to agree or disagree with each one.
It's to see how many assumptions we bring to the table without even realizing it.
Right, and to see how these assumptions are really the foundation of every argument we make about God. And it all comes down to this, the assumptions we make and the limitations of indirect evidence.
So a final thought for you to consider. If the way we typically think about proof and evidence breaks down when we try to apply it to God, what does that mean? What new tools, what new ways of understanding might we need to develop? Or is it even possible to prove or disprove the existence of God? Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have, but this is really just the beginning.
Exactly. So if you enjoyed this exploration, be sure to like and subscribe to Teolumen Insights for more in-depth discussions. We're really trying to unpack these big questions and shed some light on these complex and fascinating topics.
And we want to hear from you too. What are your thoughts on these arguments? What assumptions do you find yourself making? Join the conversation in the comments below.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Teolumen Insights.